Welcome to 24 Hours of Past, 20 years of past learnings and future vision. We're excited you could join us today for Devin Knight's session, Power BI Streaming Datasets with Microsoft Flow. This 24 Hours of Past consists of 24 consecutive live webinars delivered by expert speakers from the past community. The sessions will be recorded and posted online after the event. You will receive an email letting you know when these are available. My name is Donna Johnson. I'm a BI developer and financial analyst for Baptist Memorial Healthcare Corporation in Memphis, Tennessee. I have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Devin. If you require technical assistance, please type your request into the question pane located on the right side of your screen and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. Please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session, which will pop up after the webinar ends in your web browser. Your feedback is really important to us for future events, so please take a moment to complete this. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Microsoft and Intel. The staging of 24 Hours of Past wouldn't be possible without their generous support, and they are the reason this event is available free of charge. So if you would like to learn more about Microsoft or Intel and sign up for information on how they can help you, please visit the sponsors page of the 24 Hours of Past website. Keep learning all year long with PASS. Please visit pass.org and check out all of the free educational resources available to PASS members. Also, don't forget the PASS Summit 2019 will be happening on November 5th in Seattle, Washington. Head over to passsummit.com and register today. And without further ado, here is Devin with Power BI Streaming Datasets with Microsoft Flow.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Donna, for the introduction. I think we have a pretty fun session today, so I hope you are ready to hang in here with me, and we're going to make it pretty interactive as I think a virtual session could possibly be. Again, my name is Devin Knight. Thank you, Donna, for the introduction. Very briefly, because we're going to have limited time, I'm an author of several books, the latest one being a Power BI book that came out last October. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. I've been one for a number of years. And then I blog quite a bit at my website, devinknightsql.com, where I blog very regularly about Power BI, some about Power BI custom visuals. I also blog quite a bit also about some of the new updates that come out with Power BI. So again, the session that, like Donna introduced, that we're going to be working through today is Power BI Streaming Datasets with Microsoft Flow. So we're going to be really focused on how Power BI and Flow integrate together. And many of you, I would assume, are very familiar with Power BI, at least the phrase. But I would also assume that maybe many of you have not touched or played with, or in some cases, maybe even heard of Microsoft Flow. And so what we're going to walk you through today is how these two tools can work together really effectively. So our plan for today is we're going to talk a little bit about what Power BI streaming datasets are, because I don't want to assume that you know what those are as well. So we'll talk a bit about those. Then we'll also walk you through how to create a Power BI streaming dataset. And then our end goal is we're going to walk you through how you can use Microsoft Flow to push data from whatever the data source may be into Power BI. And we're going to do that through two different examples, two different data sources in our set of examples that we're going to do. And we're going to show how that can actively be pushed into Power BI real time. All right, so when you hear the word streaming, that's kind of the term that is listed inside of Power BI. It's a streaming data set, but it's really kind of also synonymous with real-time data, being able to get data pushed into my Power BI dashboards real time. And when you're thinking about this, you should think about the types of data sources that perhaps you might use in regards to streaming data sets. So think about it like this. If you had any type of data that you could see up to the moment results come in, what would it be? Now, depending on where you work, it might be varying different types of data sources. So if you were more tightly knit with the marketing department, maybe you wanted to see real-time social media posts come through and see some kind of analysis on each of those posts. If you work with a company that does more machinery, maybe you want to have, and maybe you do have IoT devices on that machinery to be able to tell you things like the temperature of that machine and how many hours that machine's been active. Or maybe just an example here that everyone can relate to. As you've been walking through the grocery store, have you ever been through one of those grocery stores where as you go down the frozen food aisle, the lights turn on as you go through? Well, all of that stuff has sensory data on it. It'd be really interesting, it'd be really nice if you could use that data that comes from those sensors and actually report on it inside Power BI. So you can see how much electricity you're using. You could also see, for example, how many folks are going down an aisle, a grocery aisle at a certain point in time. That's where you're really able to get the most bang for your buck when it comes to real-time or streaming data sets in Power BI. Now, when you're working with these, there are 3 different types of data sets that you can use. And we're going to talk about really mainly the API one, which is the push data set for the most of this, because that's the one that has the most flexibility, and that's the one that it works best with a lot of the examples that you would likely do as well. But you should note there are a couple other ways that you can stream in data with Power BI. There's stream analytics or streaming data sets with Azure. So that's the second one you see listed there, Azure streaming data sets. And then there's also one called PubNub, which is kind of a third-party service that you can use to be able to, almost like a subscription fee for pulling in and streaming in various data sources that you might find. Again, we're focused more on the push data sets, the API type data sets. And the reason for that is because it gives you a lot of added benefit by using that push data set. So when you're using a push data set in Power BI, your dashboards that you create are going to be respectively updated real time. And any dashboard tiles that are powered by push data sets are also automatically updated. And let me share my webcam here just so you can see our little interaction here. You can see beautiful Florida here in an office room. But using these real-time data sets give you some added benefits. So as opposed to using streaming and PubNub, those types of data sources don't allow you to do things like use traditional Power BI visuals. So one of the key things that you might want to do is connect to a real-time data source and then use and build regular Power BI reports on top of it. Well, one of the only ways to do that is with the push type data set. So that's a very big, compelling component for a lot of people. Another element is that you may want to be able to track data historically. So as I'm streaming data in, I want to track that historically and store it somewhere. And that's one of the things that the push data set also gives you, is it stores that information in a database in Power BI so that you can actually track historically that data. So for example, if I'm looking at social media results and I want to track historically tweets about my company, then I can do that with a API or a push data set inside Power BI. Some other benefits, I mentioned that you can do regular reporting. So you can build regular reports on top of a push data set. Whereas if I had chose a streaming or a PubNub data set, it's limited to certain types of visuals that are provided to you. You have to actually use custom streaming tiles to be able to visualize data from those different data sources. So it's the different elements on why you might choose one versus another, but for the most bang for your buck, the push data set is a great way to go. Okay. Now, we're going to be using these push data sets, like I mentioned, through Microsoft Flow. Now, you can use push data sets with other services as well, but one of the things I've been really evangelizing lately is how the different tools within the Power Platform work together. So if you're not really familiar with the Power Platform consists of 3 tools. That's Power BI, which you're likely very familiar with, Power Apps, which is an app development tool. It's a line of business application development tool that allows you to become that citizen developer where you can actually develop your own applications. And then the third tool being Microsoft Flow. So you have Power BI, Power Apps, and Flow. They all are tightly knit together. And a lot of people like to call Flow the glue that holds everything together. So if you're not too familiar with Flow, Flow is a workflow automation tool. You might be familiar with other workflow automation tools. And this one in some ways might be very similar. But it's bucketed in together with those other applications, with Power BI, with Flow, with Power Apps. And you likely already own Flow if you're an Office 365 customer. So I'm not going to know which version of Office 365 you're using, but you likely already own in some cases, thousands of Flow executions that you may or may not already be using. So there's some interesting things that you could be doing with Flow that maybe you just weren't aware that you had available to you. So again, Flow is a workflow automation tool. So basically, whenever you're using Flow, you're always going to have some kind of a trigger that starts things off. You have to have something that initiates the flow to start. And so you have things like an event that occurs. So maybe a row gets added to a database, or a row gets added to a SharePoint list, or a row gets added to an Excel file, whatever that may be. And when that row gets added or when that row gets updated, I want to kick off these next set of events. So the triggers are really what kicks off and starts the process of a flow. They even have some new triggers that are coming out very soon. And I think I even saw a post recently that they're in preview currently, where you can have location-based triggers. So the idea being, if you come within a half-a-mile radius of my office in the morning, that I want to immediately automatically send you a text message that says, bring me a coffee. So when you get a very rude flow here, but you can have a automated workflow that tells someone whenever they come in a certain radius of your office that they need to bring you a coffee or something silly like that, right? So it's a type of an event as well. In that case, it's an event-based one where when you approximately arrive in that location, it kicks off a flow process. You can also have button flows or a flow trigger that's based off of a button. So use case of this is you could have, let's say for example, I need some kind of clock in and clock out process. I can have a button on my mobile device. On my mobile device here, you can have through the Flow application, I can have a button that whenever someone gets on site for the work location, they push that button, that clocks them in. At the end of the day, they push the button again, and that clocks them out. So you can have button-based triggers as well. They even have the ability for you to order physical buttons. So if you really want to have a physical button that someone can press, that can then send and initiate a trigger within inside of Flow as well. So they have some really neat things there as well. And then lastly, you can also just schedule triggers if you wanted to. So if you wanted to kick off a flow every Monday morning at 8 a.m., that can be initiated as a trigger as well. So you have a lot of options with that. Now, after you set up whatever the trigger may be, you'll then define actions after the trigger. And the actions are going to be basically what happens after the trigger is invoked. So if I say that my action is when a new row arrives in my data set, that might be the trigger, and then the action might be that I want to send it through some kind of approval process to make sure before that row is actually finalized that it gets approved by the appropriate folks. So you have some interesting things built into Flow that help you do that. One of the nice things about Flow is it also provides to you templates. Thousands of templates. There are so many templates that are available to you inside of Flow. If there's something that you want to do, there has likely been someone already that's built a template for the thing that you're trying to do. So there's a lot of great ways that you can kind of kick off and start with Flow by leveraging the templates that are provided to you. So definitely take a look at that as a great starting point. It's a great way to also learn Flow. So what a lot of people will do is they'll look at the templates and it'll give them ideas of things that they could do. And I'll even show you one of the templates later as we get through our demonstration here. Now, I'm actually already ready to jump into demos for the rest of the time. We're going to focus on actually showing you how these two tools work together, how Power BI and Flow can work together. But before I jump over to our first demonstration, what I'd like to do is I'm going to show this on my screen. I'm going to leave this on my screen for quite some time, because what I'd like you to do is we're going to make this an interactive moment. All I really need you to do for now, and the participation is required in this session, so all I really want you to do for now is go to the link that I've provided. And so I've given you a QR code here you can scan, and you can go to it from your phone if you want, or you can just type in the link that I have on the slide here. All you have to do is go to it and then stop. That's what my little stop hand is for. I don't want you to do anything yet. I want you to go to that location and then stop there, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you actually interactively feed in data into the example that we're going to use for this session. So go to that location and then stop. And I'll give you a few more minutes. I'm going to leave that up here, a few more seconds. I'm going to leave that up here for a few more seconds so you can take a peek at it. And then I'll actually show you what the survey, it's a survey. It's a very short, like 2 or 3 question survey that you're going to do here in a few moments. Again, don't do it yet. If you do it early, then I'm going to have you do it again. But once you go there, hang tight there, because here's what we're going to do. We're going to actually use Microsoft Flow to pull in information from what is called a Microsoft Forms. So this is actually going to take you to a Microsoft form right here, which is a great surveying tool. A lot of people use it for different things, but it's a form that you can create that you can then use for data collection. And so I'm going to use this Microsoft form for data collection here, and I'll pull up that link here once more so that you guys can find it if you needed to right before I require your help there. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go to first Microsoft Flow. So I'm going to go to flow.microsoft.com. And I already do have an account, but if I didn't, I could go to the top right and create an account. And I could also sign in as well. So if you haven't played around with Microsoft Flow before and you have Office 365, you likely can do this already. You may be aware that Power BI has a separate license from Office 365, but when it comes to Microsoft Flow, you can likely utilize, or your Office 365 subscription likely already includes Flow runs with it. And there's some different levels of that we don't need to get into today, but there's different levels of subscriptions with Flow that you can have. Likely you already have some executions of Flow you can do without any additional cost. All right, so what I'd like to do in this first example is we're going to start off by creating a blank flow, and then I'm going to walk you through some templates a little bit later, but we're going to start off with a blank flow. And the flow that we're going to create is going to pull in some information from that form. This form that I have right here that I'm going to ask you to, in a few moments, fill out. We're going to pull in some information from this form. So back over in Flow, I'm going to create a new flow from blank. So you can either tell it I want to create one from a template, or you can start from blank. I'm going to go ahead and start from blank here. And we're going to create a blank one. All right, and then from here, the first thing that you have to do is you define a trigger. And that trigger that you're defining is what we talked about earlier in the slides. That's what initiates the flow itself. So what do you want to do to start the flow? Well, in my case, I want to kick off the flow for any new time a survey is entered into that Microsoft form. So the easiest way to find how to do that is to actually search the type of data source you're working with. And when you search the type of data source you're working with, it'll give you all the options that you have from that type of data source. So if I type in form or even forms, oh, there it goes. You can see that there's a Microsoft form connection here. There's even a pro version here. We're going to use the regular one for today. So if I select the Microsoft form connector, you'll see there's only one option that's available to you right now. And it says when a new response is submitted, that would be my trigger for when to kick off the flow. So again, basically what we're going to do here is we're going to say whenever a new response is submitted, I want to kick off these next set of processes below the trigger. All right, so we're going to start with when a new response is submitted. Now, in my case, I've already defined the data connection to forms. If you did not have a data connection to forms, it would prompt you right here to create a new connection to Microsoft Forms. And basically, I've signed in with my Office 365 account. Microsoft Forms is also something you can use inside of Office 365 for free. And I've already defined a connection to it. But if you hadn't, you can create a new connection here, and you would be forced to do that before you could actually use the trigger itself. All right, now I've already defined that connection. So my first step here would be to tell it which form is it that I want to use as my data source. And so I have several forms in here, but the one that I want to use today is this one here called Power BI Streaming Datasets with Microsoft Flow. That's the same one that I've already sent you to, and we'll take a look at here in a few moments. So I'm going to go ahead and select that one. Now, our trigger has been defined. Our next step that we need to do is we're going to define what we want to do with each response. And the way that it works is it's going to pull in the responses, and we want to basically get the details of each response as it comes in. So we have some interesting things that we're going to do within the context of Flow. The first thing that I want to do is we're going to go ahead and add in a new step. And the new step that we're going to add in is an action. So you can see this now changed from connector and trigger. It's now an action because you only really have one trigger here. But this action that we're going to create is going to be also from Microsoft Forms. So I'm going to search in Forms again and select Microsoft Forms. And the type of action that we want here is to get the responses or get the details of the responses from the survey that we selected above. So the first thing we're going to do is get a response, and then we're going to get the details of those responses in our next step. So I'll select Get Response Details. Okay. Again, we're going to select the form. Okay. And we're going to select the responses here. So this is a list of responses. This is kind of like an array. So if you've worked with arrays before, within inside of this list of responses, it's storing all of the responses that we have. And you'll notice whenever I select that it immediately puts it into an apply to each loop. Or if you're more of an SSIS person, it's almost like a for each loop. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to go connect to our data source, which is the forms, and whenever a response is provided, it's going to loop over each one of the responses and provide them individually to us. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on in here. All right, now with this completed, we're going to pause in Flow for a moment, and we can save it if we'd like. I'm going to actually come back and save it here in a few moments. But before we move on any more inside of Flow, I'm going to flip over to Power BI, because inside Power BI, we're going to define our streaming data set that we're going to use for this example. The reason we need to do this now instead of later is because if we don't define that streaming data set in Power BI now, that metadata from that streaming data set, like which columns we want, isn't going to be passed into Flow. So we're going to add another little tab here in our browser, and I'm going to go to Power BI. And from Power BI, I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And you'll notice one thing that's kind of unique about this is within inside of Power BI, we need to make sure that we're doing this from the Power BI service. So anything in regards to streaming data sets must be done from the Power BI service. You cannot do it from the Power BI desktop. So you may be very familiar with working with the Power BI desktop, but when it comes to streaming data sets, you have to start and actually create the data set from inside of the Power BI service. So how do we do that? Well, you can come up to the top right here inside your workspace. So I have a workspace here called 24 hours have passed. I could create a new one if we'd like, but this is fine. It's already a workspace created. And inside of this workspace, we're going to create a new streaming data set. Okay, so I'll go ahead and select that. Then these are the three options that you saw earlier. So the three options we saw earlier were the push, streaming, and PubNub types of streaming data sets. And we're going to select the API one because that allows us to pass in and connect to a data set in Microsoft Flow. So I'm going to select the API option and hit next. And then we're going to give the data set some kind of a name. So I'll call this, let's call this streaming survey. Now we are going to make this pull in historical data. So we'll actually feed in what column names we want to pull back here in a few moments, or what we want to push in. But we're going to first go ahead and select that we want to track data historically. So the benefit there is that's an option that you have with push data sets. So that way I can actually track over time all the responses that I've gotten from these surveys. And it's not just showing kind of point in time values here. All right, so the value from the stream. So these are the column names that we're going to return back. So the things that I want to return back from my example are what technology people work with. So you'll actually see the questions that I ask here in a few moments. But I want to know what technology everyone works with. I want to know your experience level with those technologies. And then I want to know your location. Where are you actually? Oops, did I delete one? Oh, I made a mistake there. Let's copy this. That should go there. This one should be technology. Sorry, I made a little mistake there. And this final one will be the location. So I'd like to know roughly, you can even fake it if you want, but I want to know roughly your location so that way I can use that to actually map out some results. So I'm creating a streaming data set called streaming survey. I've defined the columns. I'll hit create. By the way, we also told it we want to track the data historically, so I'll hit create. It's going to create that streaming data set, and now I can use that streaming data set as a data source inside the Power BI service. So if I go over to the Dataset section here, and you can see I've done a couple test runs here to make sure everything would work before we did the example today. But if I go to the streaming survey data set that we just created, I can add and create a new report based off that streaming data set. Now keep in mind right now, there's no data in here. So any reports that I create are going to be blank. But what I'd like to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a report so that way we can see new incoming data appear as you guys start to do the surveys here. All right. So a couple things here. First, let's go ahead and add in just a basic table so we can see the data come in. So I'm going to create a table, and let's make that table larger so you can actually see it. Okay, we'll bump up the text size of that. There we go, good enough. We'll make that a little larger, and then let's bring in a map. I want to bring into a map, I want to see the location. So I'll drop that into the location field. I want to see what technology you guys are doing. say you guys, I'm sorry, everyone. And then I'm going to bring into the size, I want to basically have a count. So just show me a count. I'm bringing in experience there, but I don't so much need experience. I just want a count of every technology that's being used. All right, then I'll also bring in something simple like a column chart, and I'll drop right here. And inside the column chart, let's bring in, and let me make it so these things aren't sitting on top of each other. There we go. Inside the column chart, I'd like to see something like the technology that everyone's using, how much experience you have with those technologies. And then again, I'll just do a count of each of those as well so I can know how many responses I have there. And just for the fun of it, let's bring in one more small visual here. I'll bring in a card visual just so I can see the pure count of all of the responses that we're getting. So I'm just going to do a count of experience. It could be a count of any of these, but basically I want to know the total responses. All right, so we're getting real close. So I have a report created. I'm going to go ahead and save this report, and we'll call this survey report, and save this. And our next step in the Power BI side, before we can move back over to Flow, is I need to actually pin these visuals to a dashboard. So the way that streaming data sets work is if you want to see the data truly streaming in, you have to see that from a dashboard. So if I just left this as a report and didn't actually pin any of these visuals to a dashboard, you wouldn't see the results streaming in. The only way that you would actually see those results updated in here is if you hit the refresh button up on the top. So our next step is we would create a quick little dashboard here. So I'm going to pin some of these visuals. You can see the little pin icon. Let me zoom in on that so you can see it. In the top right of every one of these visuals, you see the little pin visual option, which allows you to pin a visual to a dashboard. And we're going to create a new dashboard, and I'll call this our 24 hours of pass survey dashboard. Okay. All right, and I'm going to pin each of these visuals that we have to that new dashboard that we created. Okay. That's 2 of them. Let's pin this one. And then finally, just the count of all the values that we have here. All right. So I've pinned all of these to our dashboard. If we go look at the dashboard, you can see we have all of these items appearing here. Again, still no data because we haven't finished our flow that's going to push the data into here. But we can see the results kind of coming through here a little bit. I want to make sure that we can see this count a little better, and then let's stick the map right there. Okay, so we're all set. We've gotten things set on the Power BI side. So really our next step to finalize things is on the flow aspect is to push in, or I should say push our data from our Microsoft form into Power BI. So that's our next step here. So we're going to go back over to Flow. We've got everything in Power BI set up. So I'm going to go back over to Flow. And inside Flow, we're going to add another action. And this action is where we're going to start to integrate in with Power BI. So I'm going to add an action. Notice that this action is inside the loop container that we have here, or inside the for each or apply to each loop that we have. And the type of action that we want here is a Power BI action. So you'll see Power BI right here. And there's really only one type of action that we have from this location, which is that we can add rows to a data set. Now you'll notice this is in preview, but we're going to go ahead and select to add a row to a data set here. All right, now we're presented with a couple options here. Let me zoom out of this just so you can see the full context of everything we have here. So we have first our trigger, then we have our action to get the responses, and then we're pushing those responses into Power BI. So here's where we're going to configure Power BI. So inside of our push to Power BI, we're going to tell it which workspace we want to push to. So we have our 24 hours of pass workspace. We're going to specify which data set it is that we want to push to, which is this one here called streaming survey we just created together. And then for the table, we're going to tell it that we want to send it into one called real-time data. That's how they're always going to be called the same thing. So it's always called real-time data. You're not going to modify that in any way. So you'll select the real-time data table that's part of the streaming data set. Then as soon as you do that, it's going to pop open the metadata from that data set we created. So remember our first step in Power BI was that we created the data set there. Now we're going to be tying that data set into the survey results from Microsoft Forms, and that's going to be done from Flow. So as you select inside of these fields, you'll actually see below it gives you parameters that can be passed into, or dynamic fields that can be passed into that technology column. And so if we look at each of these, you can see it looks like this one here is which of the following technologies are you currently most interested in learning? We would select that one. We'll go into our technology one. Then down on experience, we would select on the technology you selected, what's your current experience level? We'll select that. And then for our location column, that's part of our streaming data set, we'll select the location question. So where are you from? All right, so now we've gotten that complete. I'll save this Microsoft Flow. I should give it a better name than this. In fact, it actually names it for you, but you can name it whatever you want. So I can call this 24 hours of pass session, and we'll call this our survey example. And I'll hit save. Now, with that done, assuming we've done everything correct, we should be able to start prompting you guys, everyone on the call here, to start doing my survey. So if you could go back to, and if you hopefully you still have that link open. Oh, there's already some of you. If you already have that link open with the survey, great. We're getting a ton of responses here now. We got up to 9 already, 13. So we're actually streaming in the data from that survey that I had you guys open up ahead of time. And if you didn't already open it, we're already up to 26 responses. That's great. If you didn't already open that, you can get it right here. So if you jumped in late to the call, you can either click on that little QR code here on your phone, or you can go to this link to do the survey, and you'll actually see your results come up here. So I'm already at 50 responses. Pretty good responses here, a lot of US, but we got a lot of international here as well, several from India, several from the UK, some in South America. And it looks like our predominant technology that most people are interested in is Power BI for this session. Obviously, it's Power BI session, so that's not surprising. And then the majority, or at least the plurality, excuse me, can't say that word correctly, is Power BI, are beginners. So hopefully that now I know your experience level. The beginners in here are getting a good idea of what you could be doing with Power BI through some of these streaming data sets. And we're already up to, wow, that's a great response right here. So we're almost already up to 100 different responses on that little survey that you guys have been doing. Or I should say you guys, I'm sorry, that everyone on the call has been doing. And we're getting some great responses, and it's tracking all of this historically for me. So you can keep doing this if you'd like. I can go look more in depth at the map here if I'd like. The one thing to note that I mentioned this earlier is when you're working with the report. So if we go look at the report, if I actually click through the report, you'll notice that there's no data appearing in the report still. All of the data that appears inside of the solution is going to appear in the dashboard. So if I go back to the dashboard, we'll still see more data appearing in here. So if I go back to the dashboard, you'll see I still have 108 responses. They're still pouring in. But if you click on any one of these visuals, it's going to take you to the report where it came from, and no data will appear here. The reason for that, again, is you still need to have some way of refreshing reports when you're using streaming data sets. So you do have a little refresh button up here. If I click that refresh button, it will work. It will refresh the results into the report. So we're up to 114 responses now. And I can still make this interactive where I can go drill in and see where most of the folks are coming from. It looks like there's a lot in Atlanta, at least 4 people from Atlanta there. So very interesting stuff. Oh, is there someone from my hometown here? Yeah, there's someone from Jacksonville here that's looking for Azure training. That's great. Maybe it's somebody in the office with me here. I don't know. So it's a great way here to be able to see real-time data being brought in. This is just one example of how you can do this. I want to show you a second example. So again, this example that we're looking at this time is all focused around Microsoft Forms as a data source, but that's not the only type of data source you can use. You can also use data sources like Twitter. So that's what our next example is going to be. My next example that I want to show you guys, show everybody, I'm so bad about that. My next example I want to show everybody is how you can use data sources like Twitter to stream in results and also tie in some other things. So someone, my other Jacksonville person here said they were interested in learning Azure. I want to show you how you can actually integrate Azure even into this as well. So Azure has obviously a ton of services. If someone ever told you they want to learn Azure, that's like saying I want to learn Microsoft. So it's such a broad term to say Azure. There's so much you can learn with inside of Azure. So I'm going to show you just one small little component of that called Azure Cognitive Services. Cognitive Services really has a lot you can do with it. I'm going to show you one small aspect of it, but Cognitive Services has things like being able to interpret images. There's things like computer vision that are tied into it, where I can pass in an image and it can give me back what's in that image, so it can actually give me text describing an image. I can actually do things like we're going to do in our example here, where I want to be able to analyze social media sentiment. So maybe I work for a company that has a marketing department. Maybe I don't know how many of you guys have heard about Wendy's. Wendy's is the fast food restaurant. They have a very popular Twitter account because they actually make fun of people and they have a good time with it. So I want to be able to monitor, because my company is so into social media, Wendy's in this case, I want to be able to monitor the tweets that are happening about my company and analyze the sentiment of them. And so one of the things I can do with Flow is I can tap into Azure and tap into cognitive services to be able to do that social media sentiment on top of the incoming tweets that are occurring. You can also do things like translation services as well, where as tweets are coming in, one of the things I did back when there was the presidential election in France. So this is, a year plus ago now. I wanted to be able to see, tell me what's going on with the election. I don't speak French, but I want to be able to see those tweets coming in, and I want to translate them on the fly and display them in a report. You can do things like that as well. So it's really smart capabilities if you tap into Azure. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you how you can use a template this time. So I told you we talked about templates a bit. We started off by creating one from scratch, but I want to show you here, if you go look at templates, there are literally thousands of templates that you can choose from. There are so many types of templates that you can start off with to be able to use Flow. This is Flow in this case. My recommendation is to start off by just searching for the type of data you want to connect to and then see what you can do. So if I were to type in something like Twitter and hit enter, you'll see all of the types of connectors that are built in for Twitter and what you can do with each of them here. So there's a lot of different examples of types of connectors that you can use. So I can pull in, save data from Twitter and put it into an Excel table if I wanted to. I could take data from Twitter and email it to myself if it had a certain keyword. This is a popular one here, RSS feeds news to Twitter. So for example, if you wanted to tweet every time the Power BI team blog posted something and you wanted to tweet it every time, you could actually set up a flow to automate tweets for yourself. So a lot of interesting things that you can do in here in regards to that. But what we're going to do in this case is I actually want to tap this into Power BI. And so I'm going to search, instead of Twitter, I'm going to search for Power BI. And I'll see there's several templates built in here for Power BI. Lots of them in here. And the one that I'd like to use in this case is this one right here, to run sentiment analysis on tweets and push the results to a Power BI data set. So again, we're going to be doing two different things here. We're going to create a Power BI data set. And so we're going to actually hop back over to Power BI before I select this. We're going to create the Power BI data set that's eventually going to accept the values from a push data set inside from Flow. And then we're going to build out the flow and configure the flow from this template. So this template's a great way to do that. All right, so let's hop back over to Power BI for a few minutes. We're going to create another streaming data set, and then we'll go back to Flow to use this flow here. All right, so I'm going to go back over to Power BI, and inside of Power BI, that's a great response rate, guys. Thank you for participating in that. That's almost half of our session there that participated, a little bit less. But what I want to do in this example here is we're going to go over to our data set section here. We're going to create a new data set, and this is going to be another streaming data set. So similar steps to what we did last time. We're going to create another streaming data set, and we'll hit next. And we'll call this streaming data set, we'll call this Twitter data or something. It doesn't matter. We'll call it Twitter data. Okay. I will check this off to show historical data again. Okay. And by the way, I will need your participation in this as well. So open whatever your favorite Twitter client is to be able to tweet, because I'm going to ask you to tweet about 24 hours have passed, or tweet about Power BI, something like that. And any of those types of tweets will be pushed through and show up on the screen. So please be respectful. Don't post something that would be offensive. But what we're going to do is I'm going to define in here what my streaming data set is going to have in it as far as columns. So here, I'm going to return back some kind of a score. So again, I'm trying to get social media sentiment, so I'm going to score each of the tweets that are done. Then I'm going to have what the actual tweet text was. So what the text was of that tweet. And then we're going to go ahead and say that we want to bring back the date that it was tweeted. So we'll say tweet date. Okay. And then we'll bring back the username. So you better not say something offensive, because your username will show up here. All right, now you do see data types here on the right-hand side. In our last example, I selected all the data types as text, In this case, I have a little bit of a variety because the score should come back as a number. So you really only have 3 data types that you can choose from. But I'm going to have the score return back as a number and the tweet date to return back as a date time. Okay. All right, so that is my streaming data set created. I'll hit create here. And that's going to create that streaming data set for me called Twitter data. And I'll hit done. And then what you would likely do next, and I'm going to be pretty light on this because it's not really the main focus of our session, but what I would likely do next is set up cognitive services inside of Azure and get it set up so that I can actually leverage and analyze the text that we're returning back. So very, very, very briefly, I do want to show you, this is my Azure portal. And if I were to set this up, I would probably search up top for cognitive services. Let me actually spell it right this time. And if you search up at the top, you can find cognitive services right here. And you can see here, I already have a couple cognitive services created, including one that we're going to use called sentiment analysis. But you could actually create your own here. If you hit add, you would tell it you want to add a cognitive services here. And then you would tell it what type of service do you want it to be. Do you want it to be text analysis? Do you want it to do things like spell check? There's a computer vision I mentioned before. There's a lot of different options. If you click more, you can see a lot of different things that you can actually choose from here on the right-hand side. And what do you want to actually analyze? So in my case, I mentioned earlier that I could do translator's text, so I can pass in text and translate it to a different language. Or in our case, what we're doing is text analysis, where I want to return back a score of kind of social media sentiment. How do people feel about the tweets that are being brought through? So if you hit create, it will create. It'll actually prompt you here on the left-hand side to provide a resource group and what kind of tier pricing you want to use and what kind of name you want to give it. So you would provide all that inside of here. What location? So I would provide East US, because I'm from Florida. And then you could identify the type of pricing you want to do for it. So you can see there's different levels of pricing based on how many calls it's going to do, how many transactions it's going to do. You can actually have 5,000 transactions for, I believe that is free. The 5,000 mark, I believe, is free, but you can click on this to see the more detailed pricing. And then you can assign it to a resource group, which is just kind of a bucket of resources that you've created. Now, in my case, I already have this created, so I'm not going to go through any more steps of this because I've already done it. Really, we're basically done anyways. But back over inside of my flow window right here, I'm going to select the Run Sentiment Analysis on Tweets template. Let me unzoom here a little bit. And it's going to prompt me on the bottom to validate that these connections are defined. So you'll see here on the bottom, I've already defined connections to cognitive services, to my sentiment analysis connection that we saw a few moments ago. It'll also prompt you for your Power BI connection, and it'll prompt you for a Twitter account. By the way, that's my Twitter account in case you want to follow me later. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and tell it that, yes, I want to use these templates. And for some reason, if one of these connections wasn't defined, I could actually come in here and define that connection here as well. So you have the opportunity to define a connection if for some reason it wasn't already defined. So in my case, I'm going to hit continue. And it's going to create this flow for me out of the template. And it's already done a lot of work here for me. So I can see up in the top here that it's going to return back when a tweet is posted about Power BI. It's going to return back all tweets about Power BI. It's then going to look at the text about Power BI and do some. By the way, if you're going to follow along and play along with this example, don't tweet yet. Wait till I tell you. But the next step here is then it's going to use cognitive services to actually run some text analysis against the tweet text. And then finally, it's going to push the results into a Power BI streaming data set, which we have already created. Now, I'll tell you, I've had a few small issues with this template where I actually end up having to delete the last piece here and then recreate it. I'm going to go ahead and delete it now, and I'll explain why here as we go through. But here's what I want to do on the top, because we're getting close to question time here. So I want to make sure we're almost done anyways. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So up on the top here, we're going to tell it that there's some specific types of hashtags, for example, that we want to follow. So let's say I want you guys to tweet about 24 hours have passed. So please tweet about something related to that. Wait until I tell you to do it. Or maybe use the hashtag SQL Pass. Or maybe the hashtag Microsoft Flow. Or Power BI. Or just fail safe in case nobody decides to participate. I'm going to do Microsoft just as a fail safe in case nobody participates or you just aren't a Twitter person. So I'm collecting all tweets that are related to these hashtags. I'm going to do some text analysis against it. One thing that we'll need to adjust here is I need to tell it which language the tweets are coming in as, and I'm going to assume all of them are coming in as English, okay? And then the last step here is we're going to add a new step to push to Power BI. Now, I mentioned earlier that I had one small issue with this template with the Power BI kind of destination there. It always tried to add this extra option called payload, which can cause some issues if you keep it in there. So the reason I deleted it and just recreated it is payload won't show up in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and define what my workspace is, what my data set is, it's Twitter data this time, and the table is the same it was last time, which is called real-time data. Now with that done, I'm going to save this. Oh, I'm not quite done yet. I need to pass in the score. So let's search over here for the Twitter analysis on the score, the actual tweet text. And by the way, don't do your tweet yet because I do need to build a quick Power BI report to display your tweets. And I'll put the created date in here, the username. Okay. And here we go. All right, so I'm going to save this flow. It's set up to pass into that data set. And so the last piece here is I'm going to build a quick report on top of that data set. So let me go back to the data set. Bear with me here. We're on the last like 2 minutes of our example. I'm going to build a quick report. And we'll just make this super easy. I'm going to bring in a table and say, show me all the data in a table. Okay. And let's also say, show me a count of tweets. So let's bring in something like a card visual here. And I'll increase the size of this so that we can see it really well. All right. So I'm going to save this report. And what we're going to do is I'm going to pin these visuals to a dashboard. Remember, like I explained last time, our last example, that you need to have the visuals pinned to a dashboard for this actually to work. So I'm going to create and pin these to a dashboard. We'll pin it to a new dashboard this time. So we'll call this our Twitter dashboard. Okay, and then I'll pin this one as well. Now, the thing I'm missing right now is I need something to actually display the sentiment. So we brought in that whole sentiment analysis. Let's do something to display that. One thing you should note is, hey, you can use any kind of visual you want. If I wanted to, I could even bring in a custom visual here from the marketplace. And maybe I wanted to see this in some kind of a gauge, or I think there's a nice circular gauge here. Yeah, let's select that one. So I can bring in a third-party visual here in this case. And let's just say we want to analyze the score, the average score inside of that gauge. So I'm already collecting some tweets here. So let's select average, and then let's pin this one as well. All right. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the dashboard that we created. Okay. Here are the tweets coming in. Again, some of these might be others because it's just looking at this hashtag. But let's see if you can tweet now. About 24 hours have passed. Hopefully something positive so we can bump up our positivity on our score here. About Power BI, about Flow, about Microsoft, about SQL Pass, or even 24 hours have passed. And we should see those tweets start to stream in. Now, one thing I'll note, I'm going to leave this up as I start to take questions here in a few moments. One thing I will note about the Twitter source is it does pings against Twitter every line. I think it's roughly every not 30 minutes, excuse me, every 1 minute. So you're not going to see them all flood in here necessarily streaming like we did in our last example, but you will see them come in here about every 30 seconds to a minute. You'll see some new tweets come in related to Microsoft or related to Power BI, or hopefully some SQL Pass ones come in here very shortly. All right, so here's what I like to do. We got 10 minutes left, but we want to make sure we save some time for transition into our next demonstration. Hey, look, there's some tweets. Hopefully you're seeing your name pop up here. But I also want to save some time for questions. So Donna, if you could, you have some questions queued up for me?
I do. I have quite a few.
Oh, great.
Let's start with the first one from F. Puma. Is Flow similar to Ansible?
That's interesting. I'm not familiar with Ansible, but I'll tell you where some of the things I do know that it's familiar with, or that's similar to. If you're familiar with Zapier, so Zapier is a product, kind of enterprise level product for doing something similar. If you've used some more consumer product called If This Then That, it's similar to that. And then there's a few others, any like workflow processes, even SharePoint workflow processes. This is actually eventually replacing a lot of things that were done with SharePoint workflows. If you look deeper into Flow, you'll notice that a lot of the people that are experts in Flow already are more from a SharePoint background. So that's where a lot of this is kind of originating from, is SharePoint.
Okay, our next question is from Danny Dennison. Can streaming data sets in service be integrated into a data flow?
That's a great question. So data flows, if you didn't see, were, I guess, officially made publicly available out of preview last night. That's a great question that I'm not going to pretend like I can answer. I'm not sure. That's a great question. I would have to do a little research. I don't know if the streaming data sets can be tapped into data flows yet, but that is something I can certainly look up for you.
And for those questions that he is unable to answer or needs to research, he will receive a full list of the questions and can reach back out to you to answer it. Our next question is from Ajesh. Does it make a difference if we, quote, pin live page, quote, instead of individual visuals?
Yes, so I do know the answer to that one. So live page, if you guys aren't familiar with the question here, the context of the question is it's referring to live page that you see here. So on the very top of your reports, your Power BI reports have this option. It's called pin live page. That functionality does not work when you're working with streaming data sets like these. So you do have to actually pin the visuals from the report. So the individual visuals, you can't pin the entire page to be able to interact with and use these type of results. So good question. Short answer is no, you can't do it. Longer answer is there's some reasons behind it. They only let the streaming data sets kind of work with pinned visuals from a report.
Okay, our next question is from Bill Walter. Can you parameterize the data source and add a selector to the dashboard to switch data sources? Maybe have a different flow in different parts of the world and be able to jump from country to country? He says, actually, I'm interested in getting data from several different databases assigned to different plants within an organization.
Okay. Yeah, so my first thought on how you might do something like that is if you could store the list of servers that you need to hit. Basically, it's kind of like you can almost think of Flow as almost like solving SSIS problems that you might have done in the past if you're an SSIS, if that's in your background. So how I would have done that with SSIS is I would have generated a list of all those plants or all those servers that I need to hit, and then I would loop over each one of those inside of SSIS. Well, you can do that same thing inside of Flow. So we did something sort of similar to that in our previous example. So let me go back to our previous example here. So in our previous example that we did, we actually were looping over, in our case, different survey results that occurred inside of our Microsoft Forms survey. And it was using and apply to each step here. But you could do something very similar with what you're suggesting, where I want to loop over each one of the plants I have. You would just provide to it a list, like an array of values, and then you would loop over each one of those values. You do have, the really cool thing about Flow is it has more than 230 different data connectors that you can work with, including SQL Server. So if SQL Server is your data source, you can use SQL Server here. I will note that some of those data sources are premium features, meaning that there might be some additional paid subscription to be able to use them. The other thing to note is if you're connecting to an on-premises data source, like maybe in your example, maybe SQL Server is an on-premises SQL Server because it's a different plant, then you also need to install something called a data gateway. And if you have already worked with Power BI and are familiar with data gateways, it is the exact same data gateway that you've done with Power BI also applies here in Flow. In fact, if you've already installed it for Power BI, you can continue to use that data gateway for Flow as well.
Okay, our next question is from Ajesh Chad. I apologize if I mispronounced your last name, Chadha. How would this work if we link it to an API, say, for stock prices?
Yeah, it works beautifully. In fact, I mentioned there was that additional subscription one you could do called PubNub. PubNub actually already has, I believe, a feed for stock prices. So if you were interested in just pulling in one that already exists, look at that third option that I mentioned in Power BI streaming data sets. Let me show that very briefly again. When we were looking at our workspace here, and I created my streaming data set, the third option here, PubNub, has several subscriptions already built in, and one of them, I believe, if I remember right, is stock prices. So you can pull in, I think, weather data may even exist there as well. So there's a lot of different services that are already in there that you can now feed into Power BI directly from those various services. If you found another API that you wanted to connect to be able to pull in, maybe you had your own weather or your own stock price API that you found that you like or you're already subscribing to, then you could also use that as well in the API section here. So it can certainly be done.
Now from Hiram, we have a question regarding the tweet example. How can you control duplicate tweets so you're not predicting on the same tweet twice?
That's a good question. So that would be more on the Power BI report side. So in the Power BI report, the values that are being brought in. So there's a little bit of a predicament here because if somebody retweets something, oftentimes it's brought through almost as if it was the same tweet. It shows up again, the text shows up again, and you're kind of predicting on it again. So you would have to, inside the Power BI report itself, that's an interesting problem. Now I'm thinking about it because it's really something that's being done on the cognitive services side. So you would have to kind of build into either the cognitive services side, which I didn't get into too much. You would have to do an element there. You could also do something in the flow itself to say, if there's more than one tweet coming through, I want to show the first one. So there's some things you can do on the Microsoft Flow side where you have different operations that you can pass in to say, basically show me the first, or maybe show me distinct. You could do that in the Flow side as well.
Okay, and Wynn would like to know, where are these data stored?
Yeah, so the option that I selected early on was to be able to track that data historically. It actually creates that database that stores that historical information in Power BI. So in Power BI itself, it stores that, and that's actually the reason why we're able to build reports on the push data sets as opposed to the other two. So if you remember in the very beginning part of the session, I mentioned the push data sets allows you to build reports and use any visual you want on them. That's not the case when it comes to the other two types of streaming data sets, because they don't create a database. And so because they don't create a database and it doesn't store it inside of Power BI, you're not able to build your own reports on top of it. So short answer is it's creating basically the storage model inside of Power BI where it's storing that historically.
Okay, and Rachel says, great examples. Will Power BI store the streaming data collected via Flow for future analysis?
It will, yeah. So that element is completely dependent on that little checkbox that I selected. So let me show this piece one more time real quickly. So it's dependent on whether or not you check this guy right here. If you check off the historical data analysis, then it is going to accept the tweets or the surveys or whatever may come from Flow and track it historically. So as long as you check that off, then yes, it will keep a historical record of each of those records that come in from, in my case, forums or Twitter.
Okay.
And I'll put my contact. Oh, sir, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I was going to say one last question from Ajesh. Is there separate licensing for using Azure services, or if you have Power BI license, does that automatically go into Azure?
Yeah, good question. So it does not count towards Azure. So if you needed to connect to cognitive services like I did in this case, the way that it works with Azure, if you connected to an element of Azure, like a service, like cognitive services, then you're going to be paying the really two fees in this case. If I go over the limit of free cognitive services assessments or text analysis, then I will start to have to pay for each of those through my Azure service, and then you're still having to pay for a Power BI service as well. So short answer is they're paid for separately.
Okay, that ends our questions, and it ends our presentation. Coming up next, stay tuned for our next session, Modernizing SQL Server the Right Way, with Pam Lahalde and Pedro Lopez. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, everybody.